Well, welcome everyone. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon. I'm the director for the Canadian Centre of Study Cooperatives, and it's my great pleasure today to be with Garth Manness. And I'll get Garth to introduce himself before we start into our conversations. So Garth, over to you. Can you tell us a bit about who you are and how you came to be where you are?
Hi, Marc-Andre. It's good to be with you today. I am currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of Credit Union Central of Manitoba, and I've actually been in this position for 21 years. And I came into this position actually from outside of the industry. I spent the bulk of my time working in the lotteries and gaming industry in Manitoba, Ontario, Western Canada, and migrated from there here back in 1999.
Perfect. So Garth, you and I have talked about this in the past, about your kind of experience coming from government into the credit union system and noting some similarities. This crisis that we're experiencing right now, it seems to at least potentially call credit unions to kind of really be what they are. And can you tell us a bit about, and that is member serving and member focused. Can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing in Manitoba in terms of what credit unions are doing to help their members through this crisis, and just share us a bit of what you know?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Of course, it's 24/7 focus is what the credit unions are doing, and certainly all those organizations that support them. Well, I mean, the very first thing that they did was to address the substantial concern that their members had financially, right? So there was payment deferrals, both principal and interest, for up to 6 months, and credit unions were doing that immediately. I mean, when I say immediately, as soon as there was a recognition that the economy was shutting down, government stepped up pretty quickly to announce a variety of programs. Credit unions were already talking to their members. So member discussion, one-on-ones was occurring immediately. And those discussions were more than just, we'll extend we'll give you deferrals of payments. A lot of them were simply conversations around, should I have deferrals of payments? Do I need to have my payments deferred? Because early on, of the calls that credit unions were receiving, 50% were saying, I'm in trouble, I need to reduce my costs. The other were, is this program for real? Will you actually defer my payments if I need to? Which of course the answers were yes. And so a large part of early discussions were just helping members understand the situation, their situation, what they needed and what they didn't need. And that was helpful. What became a responsibility early was interpreting all these government programs. I mean, clearly when we saw what happened, and the federal government, they jumped to the pump very quickly here, and they came out with these what looked like massive economic supports through their crown agencies to provide support to individuals, to provide support to small business, provide support to large business. But they were coming out in regular press releases, and people were needing to figure out, well, what does it mean? Who qualifies? What are the criteria? How do I get access? So credit unions were really trying to disseminate this information, answering many of those questions from their members. You know what, interesting enough, in early days, credit unions also played a role in explaining why social distancing mattered. Because people were congregating, and there's progressive rules were coming out about social distancing and how many people could be in branches at one time, and this was before credit unions had come up with their own specific plans about meeting with people by phone or encouraging people to go online to have their services that way. They actually had to explain to people, if you can't get into the branch, don't congregate in the vestibule, because there is this need to actually create this social distance. So they actually played a role in helping people understand the role that we all needed to take in order to minimize the impact of this virus. So they took part in a lot of those types of activities, and bottom line was, whatever they needed to do to help their member, they tried to do.
So there's been a lot of you know, someone who's follows the kind of what we could call the mainstream media. So I read the Globe and Mail, maybe the National Post. A lot of discussion around what the banks are doing. A lot less reflection of what the credit unions were doing. So you were mentioning that the credit unions were out doing this stuff early on. Do you think they've been getting a fair shake in the press? And then what about government? Have they been good partners in this in terms of helping the credit unions deliver on these programs?
That's an interesting question, Marc-Andre. You know, I think that let me package it this way. This is how I view it, and I'm giving you a Manitoba perspective. I think every province has dealt with it slightly differently, but in Manitoba, our government took the position that economic supports coming from the federal government, we will manage healthcare, and of course, they're both huge issues, and as a result, recognizing that the economic support, which is primarily what we have been dealing with as a credit union system, recognizing it was coming federally. If you take a look at what happened, at least in my eyes, the government realized quickly they needed to push a big amount of money into the economy, and so they pretty quickly came up with these major programs that we had talked about earlier. I don't think they spent a lot of time figuring out how you actually get it out there. You know, they said they're going to distribute it through the Crown agencies, Export Development Canada, Business Development Corporation of Canada, but these bodies in no way are set up to be able to handle this. So I think they quickly congregated with the banks, and the banks actually helped them design these programs and determine how to distribute it. And I'm going to say from a credit union perspective, it's almost out of sight, out of mind. I just don't think that credit unions were very high on their list of effective distribution agents. If you think about the task they had, they wanted to get us to as many people as quickly as they can, and clearly the banks touched the most people in Canada. What do we have in credit unions across the country? 7% market share, something like this. So they just didn't focus on it. And in this conversation, I do want to say that, you know, Canadian Credit Union Association, a federal lobbying group, they did work hard to lobby, but they realized, and we realized very quickly, this program is being designed to deliver through banks. And frankly, delivering it through credit unions is not the same thing, especially if centrals are going to play a role. You have to create 3-party agreements instead of 2-party agreements and all this sort of stuff. So anybody that we have talked to through this process from the federal government have been very willing to listen, and they have been very willing to see if they can figure out how it works. The system was not designed to deal with 240 institutions that the credit union system represents. They were initially designed to deal with large banks and push it out through the banks. So, you know, and the provinces, at least the Manitoba province, they're very helpful in being conduits of information back to the feds. We know that there was issues that we raised, went from the Minister of Finance in Manitoba to the Minister of Finance federally, and they all had impacts. It's just that the time to deliver and actually get the credit union system as important delivery mechanisms has just taken longer than the banks. So the banks are on the street quicker, providing the service, and it creates a view in the eyes of the public that credit unions don't have the same capacity as banks do. So it's an issue. We are working hard to get through it. We are right in the middle of it right now as we talk, because a very big program for the credit unions is this CEBA program, this loans to small business. You know, in Manitoba, credit unions have 50% of small business as members and like 65 to 70% outside of Winnipeg. So it's crucial that credit unions have the capacity to deliver. We're getting there, but the way the feds have dealt with this is to start with the largest credit unions, go to the next bunch, and then the last bunch they're going to distribute through the central. So happy to play a role, happy to help out, but right now there's a frustration that we seem to be late to the party, and the members, they look at their fellow family members who are going to the bank and getting their applications in and getting funding, and the credit unions are still waiting to get it done. It's an issue, frankly, and it's also clearly a situation where size matters in terms of how these programs get distributed, even within the credit union sector. the largest credit unions are going to be up and running quicker than smaller ones are.
So I think it's important to stress, and I think you've been saying this all along, there's no lack of goodwill. It's capacity and focus where policymakers tend to kind of go for the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak, out the gate. But there is a kind of larger issue that is not just unique to this event, but has been true for a long time, that policymakers, particularly in Ottawa, don't have that really good understanding of the credit union system, in particular the reach that you have, especially in Manitoba, but also Saskatchewan and other provinces where you're the big player in the small business market, for example. Is there any way that you can see how, and I'm straying a little bit, Garth, because I can't help but it's so interesting. Is there any way to see how to kind of address this in the medium to long run? You know, so kind of these, if we ever encounter something like this again, where we're not finding credit union system in this situation.
Well, I guess the one thing that I would think about is, if you're talking specifically about this situation, is can we provide them with a very clear perspective on vehicles that get this out quickly, that don't create huge administrative burden for them? I mean, that clearly was the issue here, is that everybody was setting everything up on the fly. Right? So nobody was prepared for this type of an event. Nobody was prepared to have this much money pushed into the economy on a next day basis, which was the requirement. Obviously, it didn't happen on a next day basis, but people wanted it. It was like, I need this now. How do we get it working? So I suppose if we could identify to them that we have efficient vehicles that are ready to go, and maybe this does create that. I mean, we're still finalizing agreements with the Export Development Corporation of Canada, with Department of Finance federally, to allow the Central to be a conduit of funds to credit unions, because all of those contracts are basically set up between the FI and the Crown. And you might think that that's not complicated, but you know that is complicated. Every time you have to restructure the agreement. So where agreements are signed and programs are being delivered by the banks, some larger credit unions, we still have to go through this process of creating agreements. So I suppose if we could have a system in place that they recognized and had confidence in, then that would at least help us, assuming we came upon a similar situation. You know, the next situation might be different. We may have to adjust to it, but that would be one of the things for sure. Everybody has been doing their job in my mind. It's just that the focus has been on what they know the best and what is the simplest. And I think that's just to be expected. I know there's a great deal of frustration in the smaller credit union sector around the fact that they've been put generally last on the list here to get this out. I am trusting that a month from now, when this SEBA program basically will be delivered, that it will have been viewed to be fair, because the program design is actually pretty fair. You have to deal only through your primary FI. So the credit union will still get to lend these funds to their members. There's an allocation by FI, so it's not first come, first serve, which was a concern because the demand was so high. But I think the concern on behalf of the credit unions is not that they won't get to deal with their member, is what's the member going to think about next time? Are they going to actually begin to move their business? And that's what I think we're going to have to be careful about, is will credit unions see a loss of members to banks specifically because they didn't get this delivered in a timely fashion in their members' eyes? I think that is the current big risk, and that's the concern that credit unions have, because that's what they're hearing from some of their members. You know, if the CIBC can offer it down the road, why in the heck can't you guys? And if you can't do this, then maybe I'll just move my business over there. I think that's a legitimate concern, actually.
This is great. This stuff, you know, this is, I'm teaching a course this spring on cooperatives, and it's very policy focused. So this conversation is brilliant, because one of the points I want to make in this course is that often policymakers, and again, I don't presume ill intent, it's often, in this case, it's very clearly a lot of pressure to roll things out quickly, and they're doing the best they can given the circumstances. But the impact oftentimes is that policies land in a way that are a little disfavorable sometimes to the cooperative credit union sector, and perhaps unintentionally so, but just end up that way. So I'm hoping the next generation of policymakers will have better awareness of cooperatives and credit unions.
You know, Marc-Andre, in dealings that you and I have had in the past, the phrase escapes me, but you have used the phrase to define the relationship between the banks and the regulatory sector federally. Do you remember what that term is? Okay. It's sort of like the Grand Alliance or a partnership.
Oh, the grand bargain, yes.
The grand bargain. I think that's evidenced again here, because I think what happened is the banks actually stepped up and said, we'll help you design this so we can get it out, right? And so you had this partnership of all of the key players, the crowns, the banks, the regulators, and finance, building this program because they were probably told by government, oh, by the way, we're going to distribute $82 billion out into the economy. You guys have to get it there. And so everything is understandable, right, in terms of how it worked. It's just not very comfortable when you find that in a huge, important issue, you're kind of secondary in terms of people's thought processes, in terms of the role that you play, when in fact, like you've mentioned, we have major market share in small business throughout Manitoba.
Right, and it's important to stress. It's not sour grapes or any of that. This is actually policy-wise very significant, because there are huge swaths of the economy, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC, parts of Alberta, parts of every province, frankly, of course, Quebec being one big one, but where if you want to achieve your policy objective, you have to work through the credit union / cooperative sector, and so. It is important.
So there's a reverse to that, though, right, Marc-Andre? The reverse to that is, what are the lessons we learn as a sector? So do we need to be structuring ourselves differently to be more effective in these types of situations? I think that's a very real question. We had a board meeting yesterday, and the first question that came from our board was, in fact, what are our learnings about the way these funds have been distributed? What are our learnings? What does it teach us about the way we are structured as a system? And you know, we clearly didn't have an answer that said we've learned all this, but we have to do that. We have to take a look on when this is subsided and say, what does it teach us about what we are going to have to do to convince the public that belonging to a credit union does not disadvantage them in any way at any time? And that's a good policy question too. But for the cooperative sector itself, can you continue to take advantage of that grassroots member ownership, member service focus, while at the same time be available to deliver on these big scale projects when they have to be done quickly?
It's a huge question. And I think, like you say, there are going to be a lot of conversations post as this thing starts to settle down, hopefully before too long, you know, as you say, about how the system works better together, comes together in whatever way, shape, or form that takes. The whole question of the federal option, there are a lot of conversations that are going to kind of flow out of this, and take on a different meaning or lens, I guess, because of this. So let me just maybe conclude. Well, I actually have two concluding questions, but the penultimate question around the cooperative structure itself. So you've raised a very important point that we can be as close as our members as we possibly can and want, but if we're not able to, if we're being left out of these programs, that's a hard thing to square for the member, from the member's perspective. But are there things that are the credit unions have an advantage around in terms of that structure right now? Setting aside this policy question, and I don't know if you can actually do that, but if you can, are there any advantages right now?
Well, I think it still has to revert back to how effectively we're serving our members during this crisis. And I actually don't know that we're going to know so when I say how effectively, I guess inherent in that comment is, are we more effective in serving our members than the banks would be serving their clients? So one of the things that became very clear in this, the banks did a good job of public relations, they've taken full page ads by the Canadian Bankers Association, right? All of them together. This is wonderful. Basically saying we're here for you, right? Taking that position that, you know, I think one of the ads was, we've been here for 80 years. We're going to be here today. We're going to be here in the next 80 years, whatever the time frame is. And credit unions were not capable of doing that on that grand a scale quick enough. And in fact, you had to sort of figure out whether we wanted to do some collective public relations or not. The question, however, was not, we realized we weren't able to act that quick on a public relations front. What we don't know is whether that was actually being delivered at the storefront. And whether whether we are doing a better job as credit unions meeting our members' needs than maybe the banks are with their clients. I wouldn't automatically say we are, for sure. I don't know. But a post-mortem on this might tell whether we were able to more effectively meet needs and help members plan their way through this. So that would be I guess, the advantage of who we are. One of the requirements that came out of this is we had to act collectively in many fronts. Credit unions were simply not able to address all of those member concerns on the one hand, and on the other hand, disseminate all of this information and understand exactly what's coming at them. So, I mean, our central has played, I believe, a more effective role as a coordinating body and helping our credit unions deal with issues than we have before. So the requirement for the collective became far more obvious than sort of some of the independence that we see. I get it, that's our structure. But I think there was, you know, we have had throughout this crisis, we immediately started meeting with our credit unions twice a week. We had 95% of the CEOs on every call, just talking through issues, helping each other understand how they were dealing with branch closures, how they were dealing with the social distancing, how they were dealing with deferrals. So lots of great collaboration. And so I think we came together quickly, and I think the fact that we are generally cooperative groups, that really came to the fore, but that was by necessity as much as by design. And I think it'll be interesting coming out of this, as we've said earlier, on the debriefing side, how are we going to structure ourselves to figure out how we best function going forward?
So these are big collective action questions and challenges that I think you've rightly pointed to as in these crises, we tend to find a way to kind of work together, but what happens afterwards is the next big question. And who knows what the answer is. But before we started recording, you and I were just talking about some of how much of this crisis will play out in the medium term, right? Like how much are we going to stay away from other people and respect social distancing? So it's a bit of it's an unknown, but maybe this changes the conversation, because there has been, I think it's fair to say, there's been a trend towards more individual autonomous action in the last few years in the credit union system. So, you know, maybe that'll change. So I shouldn't be making statements. I should be asking questions. I will conclude with a question then, Garth, and you can reflect on that if you like. But do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share about this and the credit union response and the cooperative sector response to this crisis?
You know, so what I would say is this is early days, obviously. You know, one of my comments early, and I don't know when you're going to show this, so maybe it won't be accurate in the end, but I think we have no idea what the fiscal fallout is. So I think we know there's an economic issue that's going to occur with you know, individuals and businesses in the economy, but there's also going to be a fiscal impact here, because there's tremendous deficits that are going to be taken on, and therefore there has to be a different tax structure that's going to get created. All of this stuff is unknown. And so although the first look at this from a credit union perspective is what do we do to help get this money out, the longer term perspective is are we as institutions able to maintain our viability to be able to continue to provide services, and are we actually going to be able to help our members come through this? I take a look at this from as a family person, I have to figure out my own economics and figure my way through this. The entity like the credit union has to figure out their economics and figure out their way through this. And then economically as a country, we have to figure out where we stand and how we all get through this. And so the real question is, what's the role credit unions are going to be able to play in that? What's their capacity going to be? And what can they actually provide to their membership to help them get through this? And are we going to be 25 credit unions in Manitoba that do this? Are we going to be 240 credit unions in Canada that do this? Are we going to have to come together in a much more cooperative fashion than maybe we have in the past, to be able to provide the services that are going to be needed, to be able to have our own economic viability to be able to provide the service and to continue. So those to me are the questions. This would be a great case study. The trouble is we're living it, and we're gonna have to get through it together.
Garth Manness, thank you so much. That was a wonderful reflection. I really appreciate your time today, and look forward to seeing you in person before too long.
Always, Andre. Thank you.